What I'm going to present is actually part of, or drawn from my new book, which will be out early next year, and which is called Engaging Enemies. And the subtitle is Peacemaking and Diplomacy in the Human Interest. And that title and subtitle define really what my life's work has been in international politics. And that is to look at the world as a global citizen, not merely as an American citizen, and to see how conflict can be subordinated or even eliminated in the pursuit of peace. And I think it hardly needs emphasis these days that diplomacy is very much in decline. And the focus is more and more on military options. And so one other reason for choosing this very timely topic is to suggest that, that these are multi-level situations in the South China Sea and on the Korean Peninsula. Multi-level in the sense that at one level, especially within the mainstream media, the focus is on threats and what can be done about them, with the unspoken assumption that the United States is always in the position of responding to threats rather than having some responsibility for them. And so the US is always playing the role of a responder to a protagonist. In one case, it happens to be North Korea, and in the other case, China. And I think a more objective analysis, which I'll try to present in the short time we have together, will show that the situation is, as we always like to say, complex. Certainly far more complicated than one would think reading even the New York Times, heaven forbid. So that's one thing. And the other element of it is that while these are indeed hotspots, there is nothing at all that suggests that they must end up in violence or some further escalation beyond where things are right now. There are plenty of options for moving both of these situations. Granted, they're of course, very different in kind, but moving those situations onto a whole different plane in which there are opportunities for resolution or at least management. So that sort of lays the groundwork for, I guess, both philosophically and in terms of what I want to present. So let's start with Korea, and I think the first order of business really is to try to understand where the North Koreans are coming from. Because if we can try to get a grasp of that, I think we have a better notion of where the typical American perspective, including the official one in Washington, and not just in this administration, but in previous ones, tends to go off course. I won't try to go through reading through all this. I mean, you can do that for yourselves. And by the way, I'll say, if anyone wants a copy of my presentation, I have no property interest in it.
We do.
Yeah, just share it.
You can have it, or you can read the book that's coming out later. A militant nationalism, a fierce desire to maintain independence of policy making, a mistrust of the outside world because there really are very few faithful friends. Most especially these days, that's relevant to China. Insecurity, born of a pervasive sense of threats. And we see this all the time, and most recently in the North Korean concern about these large-scale joint military exercises now being undertaken, and undertaken twice a year, actually, by US and Republic of Korea, South Korea forces. And then a need for international attention to its interests, security guarantees from the great powers, and respect for regime legitimacy. That, I'll pause to say, that word respect as I did my research for this book on engagement, and I'll say that there are several different case studies that I used to in talking about a strategy of engagement, taking the notion of engagement very seriously, and not so that it means something much deeper than just talking to somebody. But what I found consistently, whether we were dealing with the United States and Iran, or the US and the DPRK, or North Korea, or the United States and China, or China and Japan, and these are all or Israel and Palestine, these are all the cases that I used. The word respect kept coming up again and again by those who were on the downside, who were the less powerful in that two-dyad situation. It's a word used constantly by the Iranians, for example, and by the Palestinians, and so forth and so on. And to us, it may seem like a very ordinary thing, in terms of interpersonal relations, but it's a very, very important thing that is so often lacking, because it doesn't mean acceptance of what the other side is doing. The North Korean regime is a brutal regime, and that's been well documented by the United Nations and so many others. But so it's not a matter of liking or failing to criticize their human rights policies. But at the level of government-to-government relationships, respect for the legitimacy of which to the North Koreans is very much focused on nuclear weapons, is very, very important. Now, to jump to the immediate or very recent situation, this is what I would suggest is the full range of possible American options in dealing with this very difficult regime and the nuclear and missile capabilities that it has now amply demonstrated. The options have become very limited because of the failure to use diplomacy in the past. The one time when there was a successful diplomacy was back in the Bill Clinton years in 1994, when a so-called agreed framework in 1994 essentially provided for an exchange of North Korean agreement to freeze its nuclear energy program in exchange for energy assistance. And although if you read our press, there's a tendency to say that it was North Korea that cheated on the agreement. In fact, the actual, I think the facts of the matter are that it was the Americans, and in particular the US Congress, that failed to follow through on commitments. And in a very complicated history, but essentially that agreement began to wither away. It was accompanied by the creation of an institution which for a while had much hope, so-called Sixparty talks, which also involved South Korea, Japan, Russia, and China. And that is now moribund, which is not to say it couldn't be revived. In fact, the Chinese have tried to push for its revival any number of times. But there again, the United States has fallen short. And essentially, the American position through the last three administrations at least has been, you North Koreans stop and have inspected and verified your nuclear weapons program, and then we'll talk about possible things that rewards for that. It's a reversal of carrots and sticks. And that is a loser from the very beginning, at least in my understanding of what the North Koreans are all about. If I were sitting in Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, I would have no interest in such a proposal. And so there's been a lost opportunity between the mid-1990s and then the creation of the Six-Party talks and the present, where through various US administrations that same position has held, that we want verifiable denuclearization, and then we'll talk about other possibilities, including diplomatic recognition, assurances of North Korea's, which is to say the regime's legitimacy and security, and so forth. And then a peace treaty that would end finally and formally the Korean War. All of those things have been talked about endlessly by various Korea specialists in the United States and in Europe, but we've never really reached that point because there's been such resistance within the U.S. establishment, whether it's in a Democratic or a Republican administration. In the Obama administration, that first notion of peaceful pressure, which are words that were recently used by Secretary Tillerson, those were called strategic patience. Supposedly, the Trump administration has overturned strategic patience in favor of peaceful pressure. It's pretty much the same thing. You know? I mean, I'm sure translated into Korean, peaceful pressure does not sounds like pressure. and the peaceful part gets, that's just a throwaway line. And I think, it's legitimately so. Because the situation in and around the Korean Peninsula remains one of overwhelming American power, frequently on display, as is at present with the joint training exercises and the overflights of Korean territory by B-52s and so on. And so it's hard to give credibility to the notion of peaceful pressure. Now, the one thing that Secretary Tillerson did say, which was somewhat new, was the promise that that U.S. policy was not regime change. That's good. However, it's hard to know these days to what extent, if at all, the Secretary of State speaks for the President or any other top U.S. official. And the message, even one that seems to be something of a breakthrough, tends to get lost in the fog. And so there's been, so far as I know, no substantial diplomatic effort. Although it is sometimes rumored that there is once again, the so-called New York Channel, which refers to interaction between delegations at the United Nations, is ongoing. That has been used to some effect in the past. Whether it's at all being utilized today is hard to know. But in the meantime, the shows of force certainly continue. There is now very much in the public dialogue, you can read about it in the New York Times just in the last few days, talk of preemptive attack, which, according to military analysts, would be just a terrible catastrophe especially, of course, for the Korean people themselves, with at least 1 million lives lost and extraordinary damage to economies and so forth. But there is talk about that. There's a lot of, as you know, from President Trump on down, a great deal of pressure on China in the mistaken belief, I underline that, mistaken belief that China really holds the key to whether or not North Korea is going to come around to the American point of view. That notion goes back, and why I say it's mistaken, goes back to what I said earlier about North Korean attitudes toward the world. And that militant nationalism and strong sense of independence and not wanting anyone else, whether it's the Chinese or the Russians or whoever, to have any leverage over decision-making becomes very powerful and very relevant to this idea that China holds the key. Yes, it is certainly true that the North Korean economy is very dependent for trade on China. And it's certainly also true that the Chinese have, to a considerable extent, but by no means completely, exercised the sanctions on North Korea that have been voted upon time and again by the UN Security Council. But the Chinese, for their own reasons, are not about to turn off the fuel spigot. They're not about to completely terminate cross-border trade, which goes on. They're not about to completely end laundering of money so that the North Koreans have access to international banking, including American banking facilities and so forth. So the pressure on China, which gets repeated endlessly, China, if only China would come around, we'll be out of the woods, is, I think, a very serious policy error that has been committed again and again by various U.S. administrations, but there it is. I've mentioned already denuclearize and then we'll talk. That has not worked. One of the more interesting ideas, freeze for freeze, comes out of China. The Chinese have presented the view that if the United States and South Korea will no longer carry out their joint training maneuvers, then the North Koreans will agree to suspend testing of missiles and nuclear weapons. Personally, I think there's something there to talk about. And evidently the North Koreans have quietly assented to the Chinese proposal. But the United States has dismissed it out of hand. And so freeze for freeze is again, not on the table. But there is still the possibility, even if it's not taken seriously yet, of dialogue, and that can take place in one of two ways, and probably more than that. One would be to resume those six-party talks. That would be the easiest way, and get back to the principle of action for action, which is embedded in one of the final documents that came out of the six-party talks in 2005. And that notion is very simply, let's not try to, solve the whole ball of wax all at once. Let's do step by step. You do one thing, we do one thing. You do one thing, we do one thing. Step by step, take it up to finally dealing with the nuclear weapon issue. Of course, circumstances have changed now.
Wow, what was that?
Circumstances have changed now. I think.
Got it.
Whereas in past times, we could still speak about the possibility of actual denuclearization by North Korea. That is to say, actually giving up, in one form or another, their nuclear weapons. It ain't going to happen anymore. I think the best that one can hope for now is that the North Koreans, under international inspection and verification, agree to some essentially warehousing of their nuclear weapons, which would still be a significant development. But that remains to be seen. The other possibility, which I'll take credit for because it's just my own idea here, developing something that Northeast Asia, NEA, could sorely use, and that is to have its own ongoing institutionalized security, I call it security dialogue mechanism, whereby the major states of Northeast Asia, and certainly that would include North Korea, if it's willing, or whenever it's willing to be part of that idea, would come together to discuss any number of a range of security-affected issues. And those could include a lot of other things besides the nuclear issue. They could include environmental issues, labor issues, economic concerns of one sort or another. Because in my understanding of diplomacy, especially when it involves adversaries who have been at each other, like the US and North Korea for a very long time, the surest way to kill talks is by starting with the toughest issue first. The toughest issue first. You need to develop trust and confidence. And that applies to all the cases I mentioned that I've been exploring for this book. And so what you don't want to start with right away, as between the US and North Korea, or between the US and South Korea on one side and North Korea on the other, is, okay, get rid of your nuclear weapons. It's not going to happen. The North Koreans need to get some carrots. There need to be some carrots. Diplomatic recognition, grassroots economic development assistance, of the sort that some NGOs like ours right here in Portland, Mercy Corps, have very effectively provided. Security assurances, these are the kinds of things that, as they take hold and show that they are working, then begin to convince the North Koreans that they don't need nuclear weapons for security. But that's very much not in the cards right now. And so while they're not, the North Koreans are going to do what they do best. You know, during this brief Kim Jong-un era, they have been investing heavily, as you can see every day, it seems, in the newspaper, in nuclear, missile, and other kinds of military assets. And of course, the longer we go on without effective diplomacy, the closer they will come to eventually having an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of covering the entire U.S. And fitted with a nuclear weapon. When that will happen, it's hard to say, but certainly their nuclear and missile arsenal continues to get more developed. By some estimates, the North Koreans now have as many as 20 nuclear warheads, and by next year there'll be more. Back in the Clinton era, in the mid-1990s, at the time of the first nuclear crisis between the US and the DPRK, we were only talking about 3 to 6 nuclear weapons. So that's why I say there's been tragically a lost opportunity to engage the North Koreans. There may well be new armed provocations that occur. There will continue to be a defiance of sanctions with the help of Chinese entrepreneurs who can make a fast dollar, as well as others in the international business world. Missile components may proliferate to other countries that would like to have them, as with Pakistan in the past. Cyber warfare will continue to be going on. And the one thing that the North Koreans await is talking. And here again, our media has been very misleading. The typical story, no matter which media you read or hear from, is that the North Koreans are not interested in talking. All they want to do is, further develop their weapons arsenal. But just recently, when things were at a particularly tense moment between Trump and Kim Jong-un, the North Koreans issued a statement that was mistranslated in the West, and which used a phrase that has been used time and again by North Korean leaders, up to and now including the present. In other words, all 3 Kims who have led in North Korea, that the United States, as if it is willing to no longer display hostile intent, it's a very key phrase, hostile intent, we are open to talks. But the way the particular official statement out of Pyongyang was worded, it made it seem that that talks were inconceivable, that there was no basis for having any kind of talks under any circumstance. It was a very simple mistranslation, but it carried the day. And so as a result, everyone is convinced that the North Koreans have no interest in talks. But in fact, they've always been interested in talking. The question is, on what basis is the talking going to take place? Is it going to take place with preconditions, namely, you denuclearize, or is it going to take place without preconditions, in which we can talk about a package deal of some kind? If I'm wrong, if I'm totally wrong, and I'm open to that incredible possibility, then at the very least we will have tested their intentions. Nothing is lost by testing the other side's intentions. You can always reach for the gun, and the trouble is that we tend to reach for it, first, a la cowboy diplomacy, and then we wonder why the other guys, are reaching for theirs too. So there's a whole different way of doing business. And I do believe that the North Koreans are willing to talk. And right now, as we experience a pause between the U.S. and North Korea, which we can all be grateful for, because it looked pretty ominous for a while. I can imagine that the North Koreans are waiting for some signal. And although folks on the Trump administration side are saying, aha, you see, force worked. See, they backed down. Again, a different way of reading who the other side is and what they're about. And then next week or next month or whatever, when the North Koreans carry out their 6th nuclear test, we'll say, oh, how dare they? How can they do that? And then we'll be right back to square one, and with the perfidious North Koreans and our best of intentions, and the same good guy, bad guy scenario will unfold once again. Well, what can happen in this situation is that we can, very quickly move to a stage of miscalculation, and at that point, all bets are off as to what might precipitate a disastrous clash. So there's your hotspot number 1. Very hot, capable of management if the right tools are used. So just for geographic orientation, we're talking about this area containing a substantial number of islets or rocks, and with claimants to this territory that include, of course, China, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei, and in which there have been clashes in line with this territorial dispute for a number of years, going back to the 1970s, principally involving China and on one side and either the Philippines or Vietnam on the other. Homing in more precisely, we're talking about an area that for the Chinese is well within their sovereignty, and that's a problem right off the bat. The Chinese have a so-called 9-dash line that defines their claim. And the key, and the reason that it has become a hotspot, in particular very recently, and with considerable extent associated with Chinese nationalism and a greater degree of Chinese assertiveness about its foreign policy interests, is that the Chinese have within that circle of small islets put in military assets of various kinds, runways, docks, and other port facilities, barracks, and some weapons. And all while claiming that they are not militarizing the islands. The United States has, of course, no territorial interest in those islands, but it does claim to have an interest based on freedom of navigation. This is a very, very well-used area for transportation of cargo, estimated in the even trillions of dollars annually. But the U.S. also has a particular interest in China's new foreign policy. And so, as is the case in Northeast Asia with North Korea, here again, the real, although not often publicly mentioned, challenge is to U.S.-China relations. Now, I've always been of the view that as U.S.-China relations go, so goes the tensions or lack of them in East Asia as a whole. When U.S.-China relations are tense and and highly competitive as they are right now, then one cannot expect that there will be a meeting of the minds on important issues such as North Korea and such as the South China Sea. So that whereas the Chinese claim this territory, and not just for its intrinsic economic value, which is to say the oil and gas reserves that are underneath and around this small island group, but also for its strategic value, because China's Hainan Island has become its major submarine base in that part of the world, and is thus a very sensitive national security asset. And here it is, a focal point for a number of long-standing U.S. bases and other military access points in the region. It's very much of a Cold War scenario that has emerged in this part of the world. Just as the Korea situation is a holdover from the Korean War and the U.S. North Korean tensions ever since, this part of the world likewise has again taken on the mold of a Cold War issue that overlays the territorial matter. So on one hand, you do have legitimate territorial dispute, one that is not going to be easily resolved because it involves different claims of sovereignty, always a very touchy issue. But on the other hand, you also have the USChina contest. Just recently in Beijing, there was a major a major conference on China's foreign policy that involved Chinese think tanks, cabinet ministries, and other official representatives from the military and so forth. And what they were looking at was the question of wither U.S.-China relations. And what came out of it was the very sort of bland formula, well, it's going to be a future of collaboration and contestation or competition. Collaboration and competition. And that's, in the most general sense, I suppose, that is what it is now and is likely to be for quite a long time. And this is just one setting for the competitive side of things. Because the Chinese say to the Americans, you have no business here, literally. This is a matter between us and the several other countries that are involved in this particular set of territorial disputes. We are simply asserting our sovereign interests. Now, the trouble with the Chinese position here is that a United Nations tribunal, a few years ago now, or a year and a half ago, on appeal from the Philippines government, which took this territorial issue to this tribunal, meeting in The Hague, Netherlands, the Chinese came out very much the loser on that question. The court did not decide. The court did not decide the sovereignty question. That's way too touchy, and very wisely did not try to do it. Of course, the Chinese have always raised historical claims going back eons. And other countries, of course, have their historical basis for their claims too. And it's an example of what I was referring to a little while ago. That's a bad place to start. There's never going to be agreement on who started it or whose historical claim is most valid. But what it did say was devastating to the Chinese claim nevertheless. And here are just three elements of it. That 9-dash line is illegal, and therefore all the military construction and the creation of artificial islands that the Chinese have been engaging in within that little grouping are illegal as well. These are not islands, they are rocks. And as such, they cannot be claimed as being part of some special economic zone. The environmental damage to this area has been very, very substantial because of overfishing and for other reasons. And the Chinese have a very substantial responsibility for that damage, said the court. And as far as the Philippines themselves are concerned, their special economic zone has been interfered with in terms of fishing and oil rights. The Chinese, however, have turned a defeat into something of a victory. They gave an elaborate welcome to Mr. Duterte, the Philippines president, who was very upset with President Obama because of U.S. criticism of his human rights record as he pursues the drug war in the Philippines, met with thousands of people having lost their lives in the process. And so he turned to China and did what small powers often do, trying to play off one big power against the other, and very successfully got all kinds of Chinese agreements as far as loans and whatnot. And said when he was in Beijing, China is now in power, and they have the military superiority in the region, and so he was bowing to that. Now, actually, that has not ended U.S.-Philippines military cooperation. In fact, Duterte invited the U.S. special forces to take part in helping him put down an uprising in the Muslim south of the Philippines just very recently. So the United States still has military options with regard to the Philippines. But nevertheless, the Chinese have succeeded very strongly in turning around a very adverse decision, and it has by no means seemed to affect their continuation of efforts to put military assets or potential military assets into certain of the South Sea Islands. By the way, they're not the only ones who have militarized the islands. Some of the other countries, including the Philippines and Vietnam, over the years have done something of the same, but there's no comparison to what the Chinese have done, and it's going to be extremely difficult to get them to extricate themselves from that particular path. The problem for the United States position here is that while it is correct to make the claim that China has violated its promises made to Obama about not militarizing those islands, the U.S. itself is engaged in militarization around in the area. It does so with a fairly regular military vessels going through this or that part of the South China Sea, and perhaps most importantly, after all, it continues to have all the Cold War era security alliances that have been around, for quite a long time. For all the talk about how China's military has become more and more modern and so forth, and more money is being spent by China on its military, and that's all true. The Chinese naval and air capabilities are simply nowhere near those of the United States in this area. The United States, as that map I showed you a moment ago tries to bring out, has bases and access points all over this area, and is seeking to expand that access, most recently with Vietnam. Isn't it? It's really quite interesting that after that terrible war in Vietnam, the U.S. Now is providing military assistance to the Vietnam government, and Vietnam has been one of the few countries in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN group, to take a fairly strong position on Chinese activities in the South China Sea, including oil exploration. So the U.S. is not simply sitting back and waiting, and continues to claim that it has the right to use the president's recent words, to fly or sail anywhere it chooses in international waters, and, what is not said, to continue testing China's military capabilities with so-called freedom of navigation sail-bys close to the islands where the Chinese have their military assets. So it's not a situation that is close to war by any means, but it is a situation that lends itself once again, as on the Korean Peninsula, to miscalculation. There have been incidents between U.S. and Chinese naval forces over the years in this part of the world. And one of the reasons that happens is when American vessels or aircraft get too close to that Hainan Island where the Chinese submarine base is. And the United States has very consistently tested Chinese reactions when those flybys or sailbys occur. It's a very sensitive area for the Chinese. And so this kind of cat and mouse game continues on, and as we all know, cat and mouse games can suddenly result in misperceptions and miscalculations, and the next thing you know, forces are firing at each other. But one should not misunderstand here that especially since the Obama era, when the talk was about a pivot of U.S. naval and air forces from other parts of the world to Asia, which really meant a relocation of those forces so that there was a greater American military presence in Asia, that the U.S. far outweighs in military assets and presence and capabilities those of the Chinese. And that goes for any category of military affairs that one cares to talk about, from spending, where the U.S. spends 3 times as much, at least, as the Chinese on their military, to conventional or nuclear or submarine or aircraft, and any of those capabilities. And the Chinese know that. And the Chinese are not out to test that, to make a contest of it, but they have been, on the other hand, quite assertive in their territorial claim, and this has aroused, as it should, the attention and the annoyance, if not anger, of several of their neighbors. But the Chinese have a degree of predominance in this area now, particularly economic. And those countries in the ASEAN 10-nation group, including Vietnam and the Philippines, have to ask whenever they look critically at what the Chinese are up to in the South China Sea, at the larger story of their trade and investment connections with China, because China has become the major economic force in the area, and Chinese diplomats are, of course, always letting anyone who forgets in East Asia, and especially Southeast Asia, know that they have assets that they are prepared to use and spend, including grants and loans and laborers that the United States is simply no longer willing or able to send or spend. So there is a growing imbalance there. This is not a good stable balance, because there are those just as with the Korean Peninsula situation, there are growing voices on the conservative side in the U.S., including in the Congress, who are arguing that the U.S. has been too soft in dealing with China's activities in the South China Sea, and are arguing for a much more assertive U.S. policy that would be, deliberately provocative to see how far China's military capabilities really can go in defense of their strategic interest in the South China Sea islands. It's designed, from the standpoint of these folks who make the argument, designed to say that the Chinese need to be shown that the Pacific, no matter which part of it, the Pacific is still, in the words of General MacArthur many years ago, an American lake. And that point of view, of course, you can imagine, it sounds very inspiring to some people. Yes, we properly are the #1 power in the Pacific. We always have been. There's no reason that should change. But when you look at that on the other side, from the Chinese point of view, where the argument is that the structure of power is changing in the Pacific, and for that matter all over the world, we in China are now on the rise. We're not going to be pushed pushed back by the one great superpower. This is a new ball game. In fact, the Chinese have a term for it. They call it the 新常态, the new normal. The new normal. And the new normal is that, yes, we'll cooperate with the United States on some issues, for example, climate change, not insignificant. But on the other, it's a competitive world now. And the Chinese use a word that has been used so often in the past, bullied. We will not be bullied anymore. So where does that leave us? To me, these are two situations that lend themselves to conflict management. There are diplomatic options. In the case I've mentioned, in the case of the Korea situation, the possibility for a new package deal that would provide security assurances of various and economic assistance to North Korea, and in exchange, bringing a halt, not a reversal, but a halt to their nuclear and missile modernization programs. In the case of the South China Sea, there have been on the table any number of possibilities. One, which was very recently discussed just this month at a meeting of ASEAN's foreign ministers with China on the sidelines, to actually implement a code of conduct. The code of conduct has been around for some time, in fact, since 2002 at least, but it is not legally binding. And that code of conduct, in just a few words, speaks to the idea that all parties agree to act with restraint and to avoid the use of force, which is, of course, are very nice sounding words, but who is actually going to implement those promises? So they're pledges. It is a code, it's not a treaty. But it's a code that if everybody actually signs on to it, and if there is some kind of a mechanism that makes it legally binding, then it becomes a small but important step forward. There have also been on the table over the years ideas for sharing the undersea resources of the South China Sea. China's one-time premier, way back in 1992, first proposed this sharing idea. I mean, this is a very, very rich area. Estimates vary enormously as to how many billion barrels of oil are actually under the water. But it's very substantial whether you take the lower or the higher of the estimates. And there's the shipping interest, and there's the fisheries question in an area that is now becoming ecologically very sensitive. So this too is very important to be dealt with, and perhaps by some kind of sharing arrangement, because the alternative, which has been going on for a long time, is that countries negotiate with various oil companies, like ExxonMobil, for example, and carve out, I mean literally, on a map, carve out squares of the oceans for exploration, with promises of oil royalties over a period of time. Well, the trouble is that when the Chinese do that, there's no necessary legal basis for doing that if they're doing it on a square that happens also to be in the interest of Vietnam or the Philippines. And so, you then create a situation where force is going to determine who really can drill in a particular area. And indeed, it has come to that a few times in the past. So there's the oil and gas exploration issue. And then there's the legal question. The United States, let's keep in mind, has never ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and yet we want others, especially the Chinese, to go along with its terms. The U.S. Senate, not in the past and under Democratic control, and certainly not now under Republican control, is simply not going to go along with the legal requirements of the Law of the Sea. But it puts the United States in a very disadvantageous diplomatic position of lecturing others on the need to be law-abiding. Secretary of State Kerry in the previous administration kept saying to the Chinese, we want a rules-based order in this part of the world, a rules-based order. Well, to be credible in saying that, you have to start by signing on to the rules. Otherwise, what's the point of, you don't have a credible position. And yet that, signing and ratifying the UNCLOS, as it's called, the UN Convention, is again, not in the cards. The idea of a freeze would be a very important step, which the Chinese could win some friends and influence people with. A freeze on what they have done up until now. It's unlikely that they're going to fold up all the resources that they put into these islands, but they could certainly at least acknowledge the UN arbitration panel's ruling and agree that they will not do anything more. So there are a lot of different steps that would, at the very least, reduce tensions in the area. And then finally, and most importantly, in the immediate terms, the US and Chinese militaries need to do a better job on rules of the road. Because the possibilities have already been demonstrated that there can be clashes, or there can be incidents that could suddenly escalate. One that occurred most recently involved the US Navy's UUV, an unmanned underwater vehicle. Sounds like an SUV. And here again, the information that the press reports on is not quite the reality. Our press took the position that, our Navy was engaged in an innocent cartographic expedition in South China Sea waters. They were just doing, a nice, non-military venture. They're just looking at fish and whatnot. But then it turned out, and so this unmanned, this UUV was lost, and the Chinese took it. And for a moment there, it looked like it was going to be the source of a serious dispute. Well, the Chinese did give it back, and everything was fine. But the Chinese knew, because they took a while to look over this UUV, for some strange reason, not taking the Navy's word for it as to what they were up to. And what I did was I went to the website of the maker of the UUV, and it listed 10 different military applications, And of course, the most important one is mapping areas of the sea that are adjacent to Chinese territory. Now, whether the Navy on that particular day was doing exactly that is hard to say. But here again, these are very sensitive matters. And the last thing we want to see is the two navies, and the Chinese Navy is rapidly expanding and modernizing, just to meet these kinds of contingencies where the United States can no longer go everywhere it pleases with impunity. So again, this is an area where talking and the creation of truly rules-based order needs to apply. Whether we'll get to that point is hard to say. The Trump administration has backed off from some of the things that were said early on in January and February, where it seemed to suggest that the United States was going to enforce the idea that the Chinese must not militarize these islands. And now the talk from President Trump has turned to economic retaliation, in terms of trade, if the Chinese don't back off. These are very much, to my mind, wrong-headed approaches. There are a lot of other ways besides threatening, engaging in mutual threats to try to bring this situation to some level playing. One of my friends who is in the maritime law business and writes very often on this very issue put the bottom line this way in predicting for the future. He said, it's a leaky standoff punctuated by serious incidents. A leaky standoff. sounds like a plumbing issue. Well, but it's more than a plumbing issue. And what we don't want is for it to become a serious U.S.-China conflict, because after all, the U.S. and China relationship, as President Obama said many years ago now, is the most important relationship in the world. And we have to treat it as such, and not treat it in the transactional way that the current administration seems to be. And if places like the Korean Peninsula and the South China Sea can be dealt with China's cooperation in a diplomatic way that avoids further violence and further buildups, then I think it's a fair bet that a lot of other world problems, outside East Asia, have some reasonable chance of being well managed because of that cooperative basis in the U.S.-China relationship. So I'll stop here, and we have time for, do you have time for questions?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind that I've been wondering about is the recent need for the U.S. Navy to step back because we seem to have an ability to not run into other vehicles. I'm wondering how that, I mean, we look pretty incompetent right now in terms of being able to just navigate. So how does that play into any of this?
Well, I don't know if it does. Yeah, it's, someone just recently sent me an item suggesting that that cyber warfare is actually behind those things. I mean, I don't know enough about it to say that it's plausible or not. By cyber warfare, meaning that the Chinese or the Russians somehow are screwing up navigation systems. I think that would be something the Navy might welcome as an explanation for just incompetence. I mean, I really don't know. I mean, these incidents occur, in the dark of night, and people are asleep at the switch.
Well,
and it's really terrible loss of life and all that. But I'm not ready to say that some outside source is the reason.
I know, but if it's us, then it makes us look like, no matter how much we have in terms of money and military and everything, if you can't drive your ships well, you're not going to do very well at any kind of.
Yeah, I mean, it shows that what's on paper, on paper, and what is the actuality are quite different. I mean, if the whole fleet has to be temporarily sidelined, then the notion that we have so many aircraft carriers and whatnot compared to China's or what suddenly doesn't mean quite so much. But I think human error right now looks like the best bet. Yeah.
There were a couple of cases where you mentioned that the U.S. media had misrepresented a particular thing that happened, or there was a mistranslation. And I was just curious where you get your information. How do you find trustworthy information in these complex issues?
Well, of course, most of it is from media, but not only ours. I mean, China's, North Korea's, South Korea's, Japan's. It's political science is not science. It's about all I can say is that, and Professor Wu can speak to this too. It's educated guesswork, based on a lot of experience, a lot of trial and error, and just a development of a sensitivity to others as well as oneself. It's whether one agrees with this government or that government or any government, you spend quite a number of years trying to understand history, the role that history and culture and language and society all play into making these other folks who make decisions at the top what they are. and trying to understand where, as I tried to do with the North Korea interpretation. It's an interpretation. So it, of course, could be wrong. I can only say that I feel very comfortable with that interpretation because I've been studying the thing for half a lifetime. But there are no secret sources here, I mean, and those who have secrets, of course, those who do have, I mean, there was there was a time when I had access to top secret material. I didn't mention, but part of my background is that I worked for the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica for a number of years, and so spent a fair amount of time also in Washington at the Pentagon, and that exposed me to the world of top secret information and other sensitive stuff. But you know what? It's not that big a deal. It really isn't. It's overrated. But those who do are privy to state secrets will, of course, try to use that as leverage to tell you that, oh, if you knew. Remember, Lyndon Johnson used to say this, right, during the Vietnam War? If you knew what I knew. Well, actually, if you knew what he knew, you wouldn't be doing the things he did. It works in two ways. The few little facts that you may pick up from the classified world aren't that big a deal, and they don't, and it really has nothing to do with traveling abroad and listening to other people over there. It has nothing to do with learning the language of one or more of the countries concerned. All of these things come together with the New York Times and the Washington Post and so forth. And out of that, over the years, you form a collective picture, and you hopefully are open to changing that picture with new information. But that's it. There are no secrets, really.
Thank you.
So you had said that the Chinese are unlikely to exert much of power over North Korea because of that they have their own reason and interests
Yes.
to maintain what they've been doing. And I've heard in last year some media reports that they have grown increasingly irritated with North Korea.
That's right.
And that the possibility of exerting power has increased. So I was curious that you said that they probably won't do it, but you didn't really say what exactly their interests were.
Thanks for going back to that point. Yes. On the one hand, it is true that over the last half dozen years, there have been more and more vigorous critiques of North Korea coming out of China. And at times, those critical words have even come from leaders in public statements. Well, more often, they come from what we would call defense intellectuals. That is to say, people who are in think tanks, Chinese think tanks, and who have access to the top and offering their own opinion. And those are criticisms which, in a word, suggest that these guys, speaking as the Chinese, these guys in North Korea are unreliable, they're provocative, and they're going to get us in trouble, through their actions. And we've got to do something about that. And there's been a range of opinion on what are suggested as doing something means. For example, a few people have said we need to simply cut ties with North Korea. Our best bet is to cultivate relations with South Korea, which of course the Chinese have been doing, and there's a major economic partnership as a result ever since 1992, when they established relations. And great numbers of South Koreans have visited China, and vice versa. So there's quite quite a people-to-people exchange that goes on there. And they even have military talks between Chinese and South Korean leaders, which no doubt rankle the North Koreans too. But the dominant opinion at the top in China is that it would be terribly destabilizing if we were to cut ties with North Korea. We after all have to consider the future. And even if that future is one in which the North Korean leadership collapses and South Korea and North-South Korean unification actually occurs, that would not be, from a Chinese security standpoint, a very good thing. It could mean the introduction of American military forces into North Korea, for example. And it could have implications for the Chinese Koreans who live on the Chinese side of the border. It's a fairly substantial population there. So the Chinese are not of a mind to go that far, which is why they have not tried to cut down every point of access that the North Koreans have to get illicit goods imported from China into North Korea. You know, they have not so locked down the border or the ports that the North Koreans suddenly have no further trade opportunities across the border. And of course they are, as has been mentioned many times, they're also concerned about the refugee situation that might result if there were a North Korean collapse. So there are all kinds of security reasons for the Chinese to be very careful about how far they want to push the issue of showing displeasure with the North Koreans. You know, they can keep trying to provide the message that, and they do provide the message that to the North Koreans, we really do not support further testing of missiles or nuclear weapons. And to the Americans, they will say, we must get back to dialogue and a political settlement of this issue. And here's why we propose freeze for freeze. And so the Chinese see themselves not, as the Americans would like, as the hammer on North Korea, but rather as the broker, the honest broker. And so things stand up till now.
Yeah, I'm curious, with the new implementation, the peaceful transition of power in South Korea with the new president, President Moon, I'm curious in regards to his re-implementation of the Sunshine Policy. I'm curious if input that you might have.
Yeah, well, Marty and I, so you can ask this of Marty too, because we were just saying that he's been somewhat disappointing early on this, but at the same time, it's also true. We were saying that he's in a very difficult situation because he comes to power precisely at a time when there are threats being exchanged between the Americans and the North Koreans, and so I had thought that one of the things he would do is reverse the theater missile deployment that the United States had, so-called THAAD, T-H-A-A-D, that the United States had pushed on Mrs. Park, his President Moon's predecessor, and he did temporarily stop it, but then he suddenly resumed it. In fact, even ordered the pace quickened. So that was disappointing because the Chinese have been very resentful of that of that deployment for a long time, and it would have been a very positive step in South Korea China relations as well as with the North Koreans. And of course, he's gone ahead with these joint exercises, and so at the same time, he has held out the olive branch to North Korea. You know, he has talked about once again having people-to-people exchanges, reunion of families, which is a very powerful issue among Koreans. Talked about hotline and things that actually were agreed to way back in the early 1990s. But so far, the North Koreans have not shown terribly much interest in it. He He's also talked about opening up the Kaesong Industrial Complex right across the demilitarized zone. So far, but you see, again, it's a very difficult. It's a multi-party game here, and looking over his shoulder are the Americans, who don't want to do anything nice for the North Koreans. And the North Koreans have always believed that, you know, the road to resolving the so-called nuclear question, although they don't view it as, to them it's not a nuclear question, it's a security question on the Korean Peninsula. The key is, what is the state of North Korea-America relations? That's the thing, you know? And if they can get the kinds of assurances that they want, and which I have talked about already, then, you know, then they'll be much more able and willing to talk about the sunshine elements that President Moon has said he stands for. So right now we're kind of at an impasse where nothing seems to be happening. I mean, we don't know, of course, behind the scenes. There may be diplomatic activities taking place. But for right now, although I, and sounds like you, would have had high hopes that sunshine would have broken out already, President Moon seems to still be taking the American view very much into account. You may have noticed that very recently, when tensions were running especially high between Washington and Pyongyang, that President Moon spoke out and said, you know, that whatever decisions might be thought about in Washington, we need to be consulted. And one reason and I was very glad to hear him say that, because it's their country, by the way. And if people are going to die in large numbers, primarily they're going to be Koreans, you know. So I was very glad he said that, but he was also speaking from experience, because in another time and place, namely in 1993-94, when South Korea was under President Kim Il-sung, and you had the first nuclear crisis, where there was actually very, very serious talk in the Clinton administration about a military attack on the Yongbyon nuclear facility in North Korea. There again, the Americans were acting with very little consultation with the Korean president. And I'm sure that President Moon and his colleagues, one of them is an outstanding, as Marty and I know, outstanding political scientist who's very attuned to Washington. He's a Yonsei University professor, also named Moon Chang-in. So I know he's on top of this situation, and he's quite critical of the United States on many occasions, and quite sensitive, very much a product of the Kim Dae-jung era and sunshine policy. And so this sensitivity to that, what happened in the early 1990s, is very much with Koreans today, and they don't want a repeat of it. But actually trying to prevent it from happening, when you've got the kind of leadership we have in Washington, where it's hard to know what is U.S. policy. You know? It must make the new Korean leadership, South Korean leadership, quite jittery.
I have kind of a mushy question, and I'm going to try to put it together. I always have my very conservative sister's voice in my head of, you know, but we're America, but we're great. And I'm wondering, this is my contrarian question. Is America doing anything right? And then let me add something to that. I went to a lecture by Ambassador Joseph Yoon in May here at it was at Portland State, and his project is North Korea, working on North Korea. Yeah. And it was a really interesting lecture. And one of the things that he said, you know, he talked about that they had planned out like 70 different scenarios, not unlike what you sort of put up there, you know, and it went from blasting them and total destruction to talking, you know, and that whole spectrum. But the one thing that I was really surprised to hear him say was he thought that because Trump was so unpredictable, that added just a little bit of maybe a partial movement potential. That was just one of the, I'm not saying as well as he did, but he thought that there was possibility of movement because maybe one crazy had met another crazy and they were equal. And he said that he didn't think.
You know where that comes from? That comes from the Nixon era and the madman theory. You know, you pretend to be, even, and you may actually be, but you pretend to be crazy, so crazy if the other side gets jittery, God, this guy might nuke us, you know, and so we better kowtow.
Well, he did say that, and he said he didn't think the strategic patience had worked because now, you know, North Korea has more and more nuclear weapons. So I'm not doing him justice by saying these little tiny pieces that were just a tiny, tiny bit of his presentation. But that's my question. I'm just kind of throwing that all out there together.
Well, you know, here's where my service in Vietnam, at RAND Corporation, and my deep involvement on Vietnam stuff comes into play, I hope for the better. One of the things that happened during the Vietnam War, very consistently, was that the people around the president would present options when things were going very badly, options for what could be done the next time. And invariably, this options game, because really it became a game, was to have A, B, and C options. A was always, we're going to just unloose the most terrible force on these guys, because that's the only way we can win. And C, on the other hand, was we've got to cut bait and get out. And so, of course, inevitably, B was the preferred option. And what was B? It was always to introduce a little bit more force on the ground and in the air. And presidents were always driven to that because it looked like the responsible option. You know, we're not going to cut out. We can't leave now. And on the other hand, we can't, it'd be politically disastrous to just use all-out force. Nobody will support that. But if we announce that we're sending another 5,000, I mean, look at Afghanistan. It just happened again, right before our eyes. And that, too, was in the name of peaceful pressure, you know? So I know the game. And although I didn't hear that talk, and I'm sure that very well informed, but I think it sets up the audience, we, the citizens, for something that, in fact, it should not be palatable. And, you know, likewise, even with Tillerson's speech, I just happen to have it here. I always carry it with me. It's like lunch. But, you know, even though he said some very good things, we do not seek regime change, we do not seek the collapse of the regime, we do not seek an accelerated reunification of the peninsula, we do not seek an excuse to send our military north of the 38th parallel. Okay, very good, very good. But when he says we seek peaceful pressure on the regime in North Korea to have them develop a willingness to sit and talk with us and others, and they have to understand that a condition of those talks is that there is no future where North Korea holds nuclear weapons or the ability to deliver those weapons. Well, it's the same, it's strategic patience. That's all it is with you know, new packaging. And if you're sitting in North Korea, you know what this means. And it's not a message of change. It's a rephrasing of the same old thing. And so, you know, you sit there and you can imagine in the case of North Korea, you know, here's Kim Jong-un surrounded by mostly military leaders, and it's just full speed ahead. You know? Unless and until the Americans understand the signal we're trying to send that, you know, let's sit down for talks without conditions. And so we are.
He did say for the United States, non-negotiable was, we want the nuclear weapons gone. That was our position, and he said that was the bottom line for us.
Yeah.
And that was, yeah.
Yeah, and now if he were to say, or behind the scenes really, say to the North Koreans that, well, our preferred world is one in which there are no nuclear weapons in and around the Korean Peninsula, but we are prepared to sit down and talk with you about these issues, well, that's a different way. But so far, I'm not aware that that is being said. Hope I'm not depressing everybody too much. Such a beautiful day out.
It is depressing because nobody has the answers, you know?
No, there are no easy answers. If there were easy answers, well, we wouldn't be talking about it. We'd be talking about climate change.
That's much simpler.
Much simpler, yeah.
I just, this is great talk. I really enjoyed it, learned a lot from you. Just have a couple of clarification questions, and hopefully to learn more from your answers. So one question is about the North Korean issue. So I also gave a talk on North Korea at the UO a while ago, and I came up with this idea about we accepting them having nuclear weapons, ICBM, whatever, just like Pakistan or India or Israel have them, and move on. And not making a fuss about them having anything. So, but then, you know, like, I got a few blank stares from the audience. So I wonder if you see North Korea having nuclear weapons and ICBM, ballistic missiles, as a threat, as a problem that we have to deal with, or we can just ignore it.
Well, of course, it can't be ignored if for no other than political reasons, that is, as opposed to strategic reasons. I mean, so much attention has been given to the military aspect of it. You know, every day or so it seems that North Korea comes up. It's always about how far along are they, without any attention to context. You know, I mean, that's why we're here, right? To have context. And of course, as I said, they're going to continue to work on those until they're given other options. But on the other hand, we can't expect that they're going to put everything back in the box. And so there is an issue here, which is, you know, the North Koreans do want to be recognized now as a nuclear weapons state. And they've become quite insistent on that. If we had chosen diplomacy earlier, you know, this would not have come up, I don't think. But now it's a bedrock North Korean concern. And as a couple of people U.S. analysts have said, not those working for the U.S. government, but independently, have said that, well, we may have to do that. We may have to recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. Okay. I mean, if ultimately that's what it takes, then so be it. As far as the reality of the situation, that is, you know, the actual capabilities that the North Koreans have, they know, you know, they're not crazy. They're not crazy. You know, Kim Jong-un obviously is inexperienced, and for that matter, so is Donald Trump. And that's certainly of concern. I say that so blandly. I mean, I'm actually very nervous about it. But we're not talking about crazy states here, and they know very well that the main purposes for their nuclear and missile development are A, to create a credible deterrent to the Americans, and B, to call attention to their right to be at the table. and driving a reasonable bargain. It has nothing, so all the talk that tries to suggest that the North Koreans are getting to a point where they can attack US assets like Guam or whatever, I think are very much off the mark. This is not, we're not talking here about a strategic crisis. It is a political crisis, if anything. That's my point.
So the second question is about South Korea. You talked about President Moon, the new president, and he's the candidate of the left, right, in South Korea. And the left in South Korea seem to have weakened a lot since Kim Dae-jung. As far as I know, by following South Korean politics, it seems to have weakened a lot, in part because it failed to get the North Koreans to respond positively in some ways. So I wonder, what do you know about the North Korean attitude towards South Korea, toward President Moon in particular? And Moon has a very interesting background. He was the son of his parents who was refugees from the north. Actually, they left on the boat when the U.S. forces were withdrawing from the north during the Korean War. As his parents got on the boat at the port in North Korea, and they went to the south on the U.S. Boat to the south with the withdrawing army. Back in 1950, yeah. And he grew up in that. But then he became a left-wing politician. And so I wonder, what the North Korea thinks about him. Have any?
I don't know. It's still pretty early, and I don't get a strong sense of what that the North Koreans have formulated a clear attitude, or at least have not said anything that I'm aware of that can enable me to give you a very clear answer to it. I mean, the problem is that the North Koreans are looking at South Korea through the prism of the Americans and what is going on now, and thus probably are not terribly impressed with what President Moon has been offering, while they're still involved in a greater game with Washington. So I'm sure there are those around somewhere in the North Korean leadership who, well, they're certainly much more pleased to have President Moon in charge than President Park, because she had been written off as totally unworthy of any serious attention. But at the point, I mean, I'm willing, about as much as I can say at the moment is that at the point where there might be some diplomatic activity between the U.S. and North Korea, I think President Moon will be able to step out more because he does still have, after all, a tremendous domestic political edge over the conservatives, who are in total disarray, thanks to the way the Pak regime disintegrated. And so he needs to, I'm sure he's aware that he has a honeymoon period. But he's got to use that, to gain some leverage. Otherwise, that'll get lost. Okay, well, thank you.
Yay.